The Daystar TV scandal has taken the Christian community by storm over the past couple of weeks. And one of the elements of this story that we've been asked the most questions about is on the NDA. And in this video, in this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast, I want to break down the actual NDA that Daystar gave Jonathan Lamb, the one that he refused to sign. And we're not just going to take a look at it, we're going to break down what is wrong with this NDA. We're going to break down the concerning parts of it, why Jonathan was probably right, in our opinion, of not signing that NDA. And we're going to take a look at some of the discrepancies between what Joni actually said about the NDA in her statement and what we actually see. So if you're not familiar with what's going on with the Daystar TV story and scandal, Julie Roys has done an incredible job of putting out multiple pieces that explain it in detail. I'm going to link those in the description below, and I encourage you to check those out. Also, we've done 2 videos on this already. One where we talked about the Darvo responses and how dangerous those are from Joni in her statement and in her interview. And we did another one where we talked about the common reasons why I'm recommending to Daystar that they put Joni on leave, even if that's paid leave, until an independent investigation is done. And I explained why I believe an independent investigation is the only way forward in this situation. But one of the things that we wanted to do with stories like this, at SAI and Church Disrupted, we don't want to just have commentary on stories that pop just for no reason, because spiritual abuse stories come out all the time. Church scandals are coming out more frequently than ever. We want to do commentary that helps educate the church, that helps educate church leaders on how to be better, that helps educate parishioners on how to be more protected. And we want to put information in your hands that helps accomplish the mission that we have of stopping spiritual abuse or making it really, really hard to hide and get away with. So that's what we're going to do in this episode of the podcast. And I know we've had a lot of content come out lately on this. And guys, hopefully we'll be able to wrap this up soon. But we want to make sure that we as the church are learning everything we can about protecting people that is possible to learn from the situation. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the NDA and what you can learn about church NDAs, ministry NDAs from this situation. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. All right, so let's talk about this NDA. Now, again, one of the most common questions that we've gotten after the last 2 videos on this is a lot of people who have said, what's an NDA? Can you explain X, Y, or Z about NDAs? For some people even saying, hey, I know what an NDA is, but why would it be bad? Why would it be a bad thing in this situation? Now, in this situation specifically, Daystar TV asked Jonathan Lamb to sign an NDA, and this was after, from everything we understand, it was long after some SA allegations were made and other concerns were raised. Now, one of the things that they're going to tell you, and we're going to give parts of their statement in this so that you can hear directly from them, but Daystar says they gave this NDA out and it was for all executives at Daystar. Now, from our understanding and the reporting, it looks like there were only 3 executives at Daystar. So this would have only affected Joni Lamb, Jonathan Lamb, and Tom Callender. Okay. Again, from our understanding, that's the only people that it would have actually affected. But Daystar says, hey, this NDA, it was given to all executives. It was something we'd already been planning on, and it was just to protect against trade secrets because we wanted to protect our business, okay? So I'll let you hear right now what Joni had to say about it.
So Joni, what's up with this NDA whole thing? What is that all about?
Well, an NDA is something that Marcus started that process. He actually talked to an attorney friend about writing something up because Daystar had gotten so big and there was, business and proprietary information that you want to keep private.
And NDA stands for non-disclosure agreement,
right?
So for those,
but you have to understand that they're saying that we were trying to get him to sign an NDA so that they wouldn't share this information that we didn't want shared. That's a complete lie. There was no information to share. And you can share any kind of information that is wrong. I mean, you work in HR. If there's some kind of sexual abuse or something.
Absolutely.
And so the NDA was for business reasons. And Marcus had started that process, and I just carried it on through.
So again, from Joni's perspective, this NDA wasn't a big deal. This is pretty normal. This was just to protect business and trade secrets. There was nothing nefarious going on, nothing dangerous going on in this NDA. And essentially, Jonathan just made this out to be a big deal. Now, the problem, though, is we have recordings from the meeting where they were trying to force, and I use that word very intentionally, trying to force Jonathan to sign this NDA. And they basically let him know, if you don't sign this NDA, you will no longer be an executive at Daystar. You won't have your job, or if you have a job, you'll be demoted. And it'll be a much lesser of a job. Now, again, I don't want to put words in their mouth, so I'm going to let you listen to this recording real quick, and you can hear what went on there and whether you feel like this NDA was being kind of pressured for him to sign, forced for him to sign, or not.
At your mother's request, we called you back in here so John could talk to you, and we'd give you 24 hours from the time we signed this. That's roughly 2:30 to 3 o'clock tomorrow. If you can sign that, come back in to Arnold's office, sign the piece of paper, okay? Read it, be comfortable with it, and then sign the piece of paper tomorrow. You have until basically, I say 3 o'clock. That's 24 hours from the time they sign it. If you do not do that, then you are removing yourself from the board and removing yourself from your vice president position, and you are then an employee. You're still an employee. That's where we are. Now, technically, we had to pass a motion to do that because technically you were gone. You had already removed yourself from the board.
You dismissed me.
Well, because you did not do it. Technically, you removed yourself from the board.
I didn't remove
Technically,
myself.
you removed yourself
dismissed
from
me.
vice president. At her request, we passed a motion to give you 24 hours to reconsider before you get your letter from Daystar telling you that's what the situation is. Now, you with me? You understand?
I understand.
So until 3 o'clock tomorrow, you have to go home, pray, talk, do whatever you want to, then come back into Arnold's office and read that until you're comfortable to sign it or not sign it.
Okay.
And if you sign it, then we are bound, you're bound by it just like the rest of it. If you don't sign it, you have removed yourself from the board and removed yourself from the officer of Daystar.
I wouldn't have removed myself. That would be her decision.
That's the effect of not signing.
That's the effect of you not signing it. You're doing it.
What he said is this board didn't remove you. Your decision not to sign this is what's going to remove you.
All right, so now that you've heard that, hopefully you are caught up on what's going on with the NDA that is fairly central to the scandal that's going on at Daystar, okay? Now, one of the things, if you have been following us for very long at all, you know we take a very hard stance against NDAs at the Spiritual Abuse Institute, okay? We don't believe there is ever, under any circumstances, a good use that we have found for NDAs in church settings. Now, Daystar, for many of you, you would say, but Jeff, Daystar is not a church, it's a television network. And I would agree with you. I think it should be a television network. But as we reported previously, Daystar is actually considered by the IRS, they are classified organizationally and legally as a church. Now, they're also a Christian TV network that's classified as a church. And if you go back and you listen to the multiple meetings that were held, especially the meeting that was held and recorded between Joni Lamb, between Jimmy Evans, and then Jonathan and Susie Lamb, there's a whole lot of spiritual church submission kind of language there. So not only are they classified as a church, Daystar in a lot of ways is operating as a church while simultaneously trying to operate as a TV production business. Now, that causes all sorts of problems, but we're going to treat them like they're classified. We're going to treat them like they're acting. And since they've used what I would call spiritually abusive tactics to try to get people to submit to their authority blindly, we're going to talk about them as a church today. A couple of other important things to know, though, about NDAs. A couple of years ago, the National Labor Relations Board actually ruled broad sweeping NDAs, like I believe this one will fit into, and I'm going to show you why a little later in the video. They ruled those illegal to use because they infringed on workers' rights, okay? So they are illegal to use, I believe still to this day. and secular institutions, but because of the separation of church and state, churches are not going to be prosecuted, and they made that clear they weren't going to prosecute churches. So what we have is we have a lot of churches and ministries that are using broad sweeping bad NDAs that are so dangerous and potentially damaging, they've been ruled illegal for secular businesses to use. And again, this is something we always harp on, but in pretty much all situations, we encourage at the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we encourage churches to be more transparent, more above reproach, and to go to a higher standard than that of the world. Now, with NDAs, churches and ministries often tend to take the low road and go to a lower standard with less transparency, simply because they can. All right. Now, I want to get into this NDA. And again, we try to get our hands on as many NDAs as we can. Many people share NDAs with us confidentially, and they say, hey, please don't share that we gave you this NDA. Please don't share the actual NDA because we don't want them to trace it back to us, but they'll give us permission to use it for research and study purposes. Others will say, you can even tell people that this church uses NDAs, just don't tell them it came from us or show the actual NDA. Others will say, show the NDA, just redact our names. Don't let anybody know that it came from us. But we get our hands on NDAs all the time. And one of the projects that we're looking at doing and really taking some big swings in 2025 is a project to inform the public of churches that are known, confirmed to use NDAs, meaning we've had these NDAs in our hands, and giving those churches an opportunity to say, you know what, take us off the list. We don't use NDAs anymore, okay? And if they're willing to do that, we won't put them on the list. And if they're not willing to do that, we're going to put them on the list just so that you, the public, knows the churches that are using NDAs. That is a project we were looking at, trying to make sure that everything's okay for us to be able to do that. But that's something we want to be able to do. So if you have an NDA from a church or a ministry that you were asked to sign, and if you want us to be able to look at that for research, or you want to be able to just report that a church used that NDA, even if you want to be completely anonymous, let us know. Send it to spiritualabuseinstitute@gmail.com, spiritualabuseinstitute@gmail.com, and we would love to see that, and we'd be grateful for your help. But in this situation, we wanted to see if we could get our hands on this NDA as well to see, is it really what Joni said it was, okay, giving her the benefit of the doubt, or was it more? And to be completely candid, I suspected it was more because I have been involved with so many churches using NDAs. I've seen so many of these NDAs that the majority of the time there's much more to them than what they say. And when you know what to look for, it's really easy to see. So long story short, I reached out to Jonathan and Susie, and they were gracious and courageous enough to share this NDA with us. And they didn't ask us to say it was anonymous or anything else, because they said, you know what, we know we're going to face backlash over this, but we want to get this stuff out in the open. We want people to learn from it. So thank you for your courage in sharing the things that you have shared in this story so far, Jonathan, Susie. We are so grateful for you. And because we have this NDA, we can look without any speculation, without any gossip. We can look together at this and say, hey, is this what Joni said it was? Does it fit the description of a good NDA, a bad NDA? Is it dangerous? Is it not? And what can we learn from it about other large church or large ministry NDAs? And spoiler, there's a lot that we can learn from it. But before we jump into that, here's what I want to do. I want you to actually hear from two attorneys. One is a secular attorney, John Farrell, and I'm actually taking these clips from a video that he has on YouTube that I will link in the description below as well, where he goes into NDAs. And this secular attorney is giving the markers every NDA should have, every good NDA should have. And then he gives 5 red flags that we're going to look at together that you should look for in any bad NDA. And he recommends, not signing those bad NDAs as long as those red flags are there. I also want you to hear a little bit from Boz Savijan. Now, Boz Savijan is not only an attorney, but he is one of the leaders at Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. Grace is one of the leaders in performing independent investigations to help find the truth when there are spiritual abuse, sexual abuse allegations, all those sort of things. They are really the organization that SAI recommends most often to do independent investigations. I think they're incredibly fair. Their work is very, very good. They're independent from churches. But I want you to hear that perspective as well. So what you're going to hear before I give you my opinion, because people get mad when we do this and they say, well, Jeff, you're just trying to make people look bad, or you're just mad because you don't like NDAs, this, that, and the other. And people get mad. So before I give you my opinion on any of this, I want you to hear the red flags to look for and the good things to look for that need to be there from John Fellers, right? From a secular attorney. And I want you to hear it from a Christian attorney who works every day in churches and Christian environments and ministries trying to stop spiritual abuse. So I want you to hear it from a secular and a church perspective from two legal experts who can give you information so that you know what we're looking for when we look at this NDA. So you're not just listening to my opinion. You can, one, know what to look for, and two, when I see certain things, I can point it back to, hey, where does this fit with what these two attorneys talked about? All right, so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and pull up both of those. I'm going to show you some clips. I'm going to interrupt them just a little bit to make sure that we're all on the same page. And then we're going to dive into, for the rest of this podcast, this NDA from Daystar, what's good about it, what's bad about it, where does it match what Joni said, where is it off from what Joni said, and what can we learn as parishioners and leaders in the church? What can we learn about NDA use and how to better protect people in the church? And I'm going to actually show the NDA as well as show these clips. So again, if you're not watching on video, that's okay. This will make sense. But if you get a chance to watch it on video, you're going to get to see everything marked up that we're talking about. But let's go ahead. Let's start quickly. I want to start by listening to John Farrell, okay? John Farrell, the secular attorney. Let's get the secular viewpoint on this, and then we'll come back with Bosavijan, and we'll get the Christian attorney viewpoint on this as well. So let's go ahead and pull up this clip with John Farrell.
Hi, my name is John Farrell. I'm a patent attorney. This video is about how to spot a really bad non-disclosure agreement, usually called an NDA.
And he makes it very clear these aren't just warning signs of a potentially a bad NDA. He says he wants to show you the 5 red flags to look for in really bad NDAs. So if any of these are in an NDA we look at, specifically this NDA from Daystar today, those would be signs of a really bad NDA, according to this attorney.
I'm going to quickly go through the basics of the NDA and then identify 5 warning signs that you should check before leaving your signature on the dotted line. What is a non-disclosure agreement? It's an agreement to keep a secret. You've heard of the kiss and tell? Well, this is the kiss and shut up. Most solid NDAs have 5 key components or terms. Term number 1, who are the parties to this contract? Term 2, what is considered confidential under this agreement? For example, my weight loss diary is confidential. My selfies from your bachelor party weekend are confidential. And by the way, so is my grandmother's cookie recipe. Term number 3, how can the secrets be used under this agreement? For example, you can read my weight loss diary, or you can share my party pics, except for the ones from the tattoo parlor. Term number 4, how long does the agreement last? For example, the agreement lasts the earlier of 5 days or until the cookies are gone. And then finally, term number 5, what happens when the agreement is over?
All right, so you heard John talk about it right there. He says NDAs, they're not kiss and tell, they're kiss and shut up. These are big silencing agreements. But all NDAs that are good, all NDAs that are out there should have 5 common components. And what does he give us for those 5 common components? I'm going to put them up on the screen again so that you can see them. Who are the parties? What exactly is confidential? Is that a good narrow definition? How can the secrets be used? How long does the NDA last? And what happens after termination? So those are things we want to see in any NDA before we do anything else. Does it have those key components? And a lot of these are just to keep the NDA from getting too broad and say, you have to be silent about everything or a lot of things or most things. It also is to keep it narrow and specific enough that you know what you're supposed to be silent about and that it's not, just all of these different things, right? So those are the 5 most common components that John says need to be in the NDA. Next, let's hear what John has to say. He gives 5 red flags. Let's listen to him real quick. What are the 5 red flags that we should look for and be wary of in any, as he called it, really bad NDA?
Now, let's talk about the 5 terms to watch out for before signing an NDA. These are the 5 snakes in the grass that will bite you in the ankle if you're not careful in reviewing your NDA before executing it. Red flag number 1, non-mutual or non-reciprocal terms. Non-mutuality means that I'm required to keep your secret, but the agreement is silent on your obligation to do anything. Or the obligations of the two parties are different. Especially when it comes to NDAs, I like to see the language of the parties being equal. Okay, red flag number 2. An unreasonable or subjective definition of confidential. What does confidential mean under this agreement? Red flag number 3. Longer than necessary terms. How long is a secret really good for? The longer the contract, the more costly it is to manage, and the more likely it is to be breached accidentally. Keep the term short. Warning sign number 4. Conditions that are difficult to manage. Okay, red flag number 5. Penalty clauses. Beware of any contract that, for instance, threatens to adopt your kids if you accidentally or purposefully breach. Sometimes breach is unavoidable, and the remedy or compensation for breach of an NDA should be related and commensurate with the breach. Examples of bad penalty clauses. You pay me $100,000 if my body weight ends up on your Facebook feed. Or, I will pay your lawyers to sue me if I accidentally disclose the number of strippers at your bachelor party.
All right, so there you have it, John's 5 big red flags to watch out for in bad non-disclosure agreements, non-mutual terms, unreasonable or subjective definitions of confidential, longer than necessary terms. It should have an end date, and he says keep that short as possible, conditions that are difficult to manage, and he talks about penalty clauses, and I think that will be a topic that we'll look at a little bit as well, is the penalty clauses, the broadness, all of that. But at the end of the day, he gives those examples. He says, watch out for those. Let's not deal with NDAs. Let's not sign NDAs that really deal with those things. Now, I also want you to hear, not just from a secular attorney, again, I want you to hear from Boz Savision, legal expert who works with Grace, who works with churches, and I want you to hear his thoughts on NDAs, what to look for, and specifically, he's going to tell you why he sees them as dangerous in most Christian environments. So I'm going to go ahead and let you listen to Boz.
I have talked to people who are suddenly told, you're gone. And I've talked to people, Scott, who have said, we want you to decide in 15 minutes whether you sign this agreement or not. And the agreement says we'll give you sometimes 3 months severance. In exchange for that, you have to sign all these things, including a non-disparagement clause, a confidentiality clause. And these poor people are in this position going, what do? I really need this money, but I already know this is not a good idea. And so many of them feel forced in signing this.
Now, I want you to think, does that sound familiar? All right. Does that sound familiar from the recording of Jonathan actually signing this NDA? Hey, you got to sign this, and you got to sign it to keep your job. All right. We've given you an extension. We did something special for you, but if you don't sign this, you don't get to keep your job. You don't get to stay an executive. And do you not feel like he went through something very similar to that of, man, I really need this money. I really need this job. I've got really good things going for me. I don't want to lose my job, but I feel like this is a bad idea. And like Boz said, it feels to me like he would feel pressured, and from what he said, that he would feel pressured and did feel pressure to sign this. And that's just not something that you want from Christian environments, that we're pressuring you to sign something that you don't feel comfortable with.
And the problem is they may get 3 months of severance, but that NDA or that non-disparagement provision doesn't have an end life.
And there is Boz talking about it again, something that we saw John Fellers talk about a minute ago. NDAs should have an end life. There should be an end date, and as John said, they should be as short as possible. Boz echoes that. So when we look at this NDA in a minute, one of the things we're looking for, is there an end date?
You're getting this amount of money to promise something back to them this much.
Now, Boz talking about there, he's really talking about what John called unmutual terms. That again, I'm getting a little bit of money, or I get to keep the job I already have and have had for years if I promise to be silent about all of these other things and never go public with anything that I might feel like I need to go public about, or I never get to tell anybody about any potential bad experience that I had at this place, right? So again, in a bad NDA, Boz says it's just not really even what the trade is, or what the legal term for that is consideration, what the consideration is.
And I've talked to more and more, just counseled more and more people. If you don't want to sign something that has a non-disclosure or confidentiality provision or non-disparagement, try to negotiate that out. And if they won't take it out, walk.
All right. And Boz gives very clear encouragement there. If you see an NDA like this, one, try to negotiate it out. And if they don't, walk away from the table. And guys, that's exactly what Jonathan did. He ended up losing his job as an executive, getting demoted, and then all the other things that came with that afterwards, and eventually losing his job. But what does Boz say? A Christian attorney, a legal expert, and someone who is helping to investigate spiritual abuse cases. Often, he says, I recommend that my clients walk. So he recommends that Jonathan do really what he did.
That's really what I call a gag order. That's saying to somebody, you cannot share your story, whatever it was, whether it was being sexually abused at a church, whether he was being spiritually abused by church leaders. When you sign that agreement, you're signing away your ability to share that story.
So Boz calls NDAs like this, especially with broad non-disparagement clauses, he calls them gag orders. And, when he talks about not being able to tell your story about sexual abuse, different kinds of SA, different kinds of abuse, things like that, one of the things we hear from people a lot is, come on, Jeff, the law allows for people to break NDAs, and most NDAs allow for people to break the NDA in the event of criminal activity like SA. Here's the problem, though. You can go to the authorities about it, but the NDA still holds you from talking to anybody else about it. So then it's confined just to the court and just to what the court releases. So there's a lot of your story that can be important to you and other people. It can be important for other people to know to protect them in these situations. But if you just went out talking about that, even if it was proved right in court, you could be potentially held liable for breaking that NDA because it's disparaging remarks, even though they're true, disparaging remarks about the organization. So even though there are legal abilities for you to report crimes and stuff like that, under these NDAs, there's still a lot of silencing that would go on that is not helpful for the person involved, the organization, or anybody who's a part of that organization. So for example, imagine you're at a church and there have been allegations of SA, or SA has even been proven to happen in courts, but the church hasn't disclosed that or disclosed enough of that information even to other potential parents and congregants. Most of us would want to know that those allegations have happened. We want to know how our church is responding. We want to know that our church is taking steps to be safer in the future, that they're disclosing everything that needs to be disclosed. Well, if a person has signed a really broad NDA, they may be able to deal with this in court, yet not talk about it under the terms of the NDA to other people in the church. So again, most of us, we would want to know, and we would think it would be the best thing for everybody involved as far as protecting people from future situations like this, to be transparent and let them know that it's going on. So this is more with these NDAs than just silencing people from taking legal action.
Real quick about NDAs is oftentimes within this context of these types of agreements, you have what we call non-disparagement provisions. Oftentimes, non-disparagement provisions are linked to these confidentiality provisions. And a non-disparagement provision is basically says that the party or parties, usually it's just pointing one way, and that's to the employee. The parties or the party cannot disparage the church or anybody in leadership at the church. And so that begs the question, what some of you are asking is, what does that mean? Disparage. And that's another way I found, it's a roundabout way of enforcing a confidentiality. Because NDAs today, ever since Harvey Weinstein, which is a good thing, have a bad name. When you mention NDA, the state of California has outlawed NDAs in settlement agreements on cases that have been filed. So it's a bad, so how do we get around that? Well, we're not going to call it an NDA. We're not even going to call it a confidentiality provision. We're going to call it a non-disparagement provision, which if you think about it, ultimately has the same impact as a confidentiality provision.
All right, so there Boz talks about the red herring, one of the most dangerous parts of an NDA, and that is a non-disparagement, a really broad non-disparagement clause or agreement, okay? And he says a lot of churches, a lot of ministries, they're not even going to call these NDAs because they look bad. I'll give credit to Daystar for that. They called this an NDA, and said, hey, NDAs are for trade secrets. That's what this is for, okay? But a lot of ministries don't even want to call it an NDA. So they'll call it a confidentiality agreement, a severance agreement, a non-disparagement agreement. But more often it has a confidentiality clause or it has a non-disparagement clause. And even just the presence of either of those two clauses, a confidentiality clause or a non-disparagement clause, makes this an NDA in practice, even if it's not called one. Now, he also talks about not only is the non-disparagement dangerous because it says, hey, non-disparagement means I can't say anything bad, potentially negative, that is super subjective about this organization. But he says it's usually not mutual. Again, going back to mutuality, Boz already talked about it. John talked about it. It's normally not mutual, that it says, hey, one party, like Jonathan in this instance, may not be able to disparage Daystar in that organization, but it doesn't say anything about Daystar not disparaging them, okay? And that's usually how that goes, which means you can't share your side of the story without potential legal reprisal, but that ministry can say anything about you to assassinate your character. So think about if Jonathan had signed this. Even if he had gotten away with sharing the things that he shared about the SA allegations, think about, and again, if you haven't seen it, go watch that video on the Darvo responses from Joni. But if you look at her statement at Daystar, if you look at the interview where they talked about it, they went flat out trying to disparage the character, trying to discredit and assassinate the character of Jonathan and Susie Lamb. Now, because Jonathan and Susie didn't sign a document like this, they have no worries. They've went on podcasts, they've done interviews, they've done their own statements where they've said, hey, some of those things are just completely not true, and here's why, okay? They wouldn't have been able to do that if they had signed a non-disparagement agreement or clause.
I routinely counsel my clients against signing anything that contains a non-disparagement provision because it is a subjective term, it's not defined, and it's usually these types of provisions don't have an end life. They go on and on and on. So you have to spend the rest of your life wondering if what I just said to somebody, even in passing, violates my non-disparagement provision, of which I got a little bit of money 10 years ago, but now they can come after me for violating that agreement. So,
all right. So Boz says, again, what does he tell his clients? He tells his clients if there's a non-disparagement agreement like that, a non-disparagement clause that is broad like that, it is not worth signing the NDA. He advises them not to sign the NDA. So when we look at NDAs at SAI, one of the first things we're looking for is, again, is there an end date and is there a non-disparagement clause, even if it's not called that? Is there a confidentiality clause that is really talking about non-disparagement? Because it ends up putting a lot of pressure that is just not okay for the people who sign it, where, like he said, you may wonder for the rest of your life, did I accidentally just break that NDA? Are they going to come after me? And it can get pretty crazy.
that's a 1,000-foot view of this whole issue of what is an NDA. A trade secret, that is, to me, legitimate grounds for a confidentiality provision.
Now, the next part you're going to hear is about trade secrets. And if you remember, Joni said this NDA wasn't bad. It wasn't trying to silence anybody. It was just for trade secrets and protecting business information. So Boz is going to talk about that. He is going to give allowance for that, but he's also going to give some concern about trade secrets in churches and in ministries. And remember, Daystar classifies itself as a church.
I don't, quite frankly, you'd have to really convince me that you have a trade secret issue within a church environment. Okay. I mean, I don't know that. I'm sure there becomes some argument, but that quite frankly just doesn't exist in a church environment.
All right, so now that you've heard from two attorneys, both a secular attorney in John Fellers, and you've heard from Boz Savigin, let's go ahead and let's take a look together at the actual NDA that Daystar presented to Jonathan Lamb. And let's look for, here's what I want to do. I want to look first for the most common terms, the common terms that John said should be in an NDA. So let's just see if the terms that need to be there are there and if they're clear. And second, let's look at the common red flags. Are there any of these red flags there? If there are, how many, and how bad do they look kind of on the spectrum? How concerning might they be? Now, just as a reminder, I'm not an attorney. This is not legal advice. We're simply taking what we've heard from attorneys, what we know about NDAs, and we're going to apply them to this situation to see, is this NDA, again, is it what Joni said it was, or is it something different? Okay, because Jonathan said it was a silencing document, more like a gag order. Joni says it was just for trade secrets, just for business. It wasn't silencing anyone. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at this together. So first of all, let's look at the title here. It is a confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. So we don't have to look very far at that. It's very clear what it is, a non-disclosure agreement. This confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement is entered into between Daystar Television Network and Jonathan Lamb. This was on November 16th of 2023. And so now let's just start looking for these other things, okay? Who are the parties? That's the most common term. That's there. This is between Daystar and is between Jonathan, okay? Let's look at, again, what's confidential, how can the secrets be used, how long does the NDA last, what's happening after termination. Let's also look at what is the consideration. What is the trade? For you signing this NDA, there's got to be a trade, and both attorneys talked about, is that equal? So let's look at that as well, just because it's right here. Daystar is requiring the execution of this agreement as a requirement and a qualification of each Daystar officer, trustee, and his or her continued service. So here's the trade-off. You sign this document to keep these things confidential, and you keep your job. If you don't sign this document, then you don't keep your job, and you will be fired. That's pretty hefty consideration. All right, so let's go ahead and look for the next common term that we're supposed to see. What is confidential here? And let's just look at if we can get a definition of confidential, what confidentiality is. We're going to talk about whether or not it's a red flag here in a moment. We just want to know if this exists, if this is in the agreement the way that it should be. So right here under confidential information, it says for the purposes of this agreement, the term confidential information means all trade secrets, okay, and other information about Daystar and its business operations that are proprietary, private, and not generally known or accessible to members of the public, media, press, or detractors of Daystar. Okay, a couple of things that we just want to look at there. We'll come back to them in a minute, but I want to go ahead and point them out. Okay, the first part of this sounds like what Joni described, that it is confidential information means all trade secrets and other information about Daystar and its business operations, okay? That's proprietary. That makes sense. Now, when it continues to say private and not generally known or accessible to members of the public, media, press, or detractors, that changed the definition a lot because that goes well beyond trade secrets and well beyond proprietary information. And it's now saying confidential information also includes anything that the public doesn't know about, the media doesn't know about, or detractors don't know about. Now, I just want you to keep in mind, there's a whole lot of nefarious situations, illegal stuff that has been broken over the years because it wasn't known to the public, and then somebody talked about it and made it known to the public. So information that's not known to the public or could cause people to be detractors is not the same as trade secrets and proprietary information. So if it had stopped at just trade secrets and about information about Daystar and its business operations, this proprietary, that would have been exactly what Joni was talking about. The last part of that definition, it ballooned the broadening of it. But we do know what is confidential, and it continues. So this component, it does look like is here, okay? It continues and says, confidential information includes, without limitation, information designated as confidential by Daystar, relating to Daystar's viewers, partners, employees, and their respective actions and decisions, Daystar's financial condition, business costs, income, profits, losses, results of operations, marketing plans, business plans, operations, acquisition strategies, use of assets, all of those, okay? So there is a long definition of confidential. We know what's confidential. Now the question is it too broad? Is it reasonable? We're going to answer that here in a minute. But it does have, so first of all, the common terms we're supposed to look for. It does say who the parties are. It does tell us what's confidential. How can the secrets be used? All right. I don't really see how the secrets could be used on here. Okay. It just talks about the executive not disclosing these things unless it's upon request, returning confidential information there under D. Then we've got a non-competition clause, a non-disparagement clause, remedies, which is going to be basically penalty clauses right there, the choice of law, amendment waiver, attorney's fees, all of that. So no, I don't see the third term, how can the secrets be used? Okay, it basically just says, hey, here are the secrets, here are what we're calling confidential, and you can't talk about them in any way. So that's very broad, and it's missing the term, how can the secrets be used? Let's also look, we've looked at this whole NDA now, just with a quick scroll, but does it give a time limit anywhere? As I'm looking through, and again, I will post this so that you all can look through as well, but I don't see a time limit on anything. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to scroll all the way down to where it's signed. There's not a time limit, doesn't say how long it's good for. So no, we're now missing two components of a standard NDA that all NDAs should have. It doesn't have a time limit on how long the NDA should last. It doesn't say that it's just while they're employed, okay? And that's very important. We need to know if that specific is there. And then the last thing, what happens after termination? Of course, that's not there because there is no termination listed as far as we see, okay? And again, I've combed through this before. I don't see anywhere where it gives a date of termination. We're going to post it where you can see. There's no date of termination that we can see that we believe you'll see at all. So basically, it tells the parties, it tells what's confidential. It's got the first two components. The last three components, how the secrets can be used, how long the NDA lasts, and what happens after termination. None of those are in there or in there clearly, all right? So now, let's go to the red flags, okay? This isn't a good NDA, okay? So let's just be clear. It's not a good NDA because it doesn't have the clear components that are supposed to be there for really any NDA that you would think about signing. That doesn't mean it's a bad NDA. It just means it's not a good NDA. It could be a, hey, they didn't really, just kind of run of the mill. They didn't really understand how to create a good NDA. And if that's the case, someone like Jonathan could have taken it. They could have said, hey, can I have an attorney look at this? Oh, my attorney asked me to bring it back and he needs these three components. When does this end? How can the secrets be used? What happens after the agreement is terminated? Okay. But the red flags will tell us if it's a good NDA or a bad NDA. So let's look at John's and Boz's red flags. I'm going to use John's just because they're easy to see and we can pop them up on the screen. But we're also going to look for the things that Boz talked about as well. So let's start with a couple of things that Boz mentioned. We're going to come back to these in a minute, but I just want to bring your attention to them. After we get our definitions, we're looking at one of the clauses that Boz warned us about. Right there, before we even look at it, there's a non-disparagement clause. So this has my antenna up. This has me asking questions because, again, a non-disparagement clause, Boz said I always recommend or pretty much generally recommend that my clients not ever sign that because that's not good. That kind of broad sweeping non-disparagement, from my understanding, is illegal in secular organizations right now. So we'll look into that more in depth here in a moment. That's there. Also, I just want to note there's a non-compete clause, a non-competition clause. We'll talk about that here and more in just a moment. But let's go back up to the top and let's start looking for these red flags. The number one red flag that John talked about is non-mutual terms. Boz talked about that as well. So let's just look at this. The initial term, the initial consideration is, hey, Jonathan, you get to keep the job that you already have and have had for years. You get to keep the job, not lose the job, not get demoted, not lose a bunch of pay if you sign this document to now be silent about all these things, okay? I don't think that's mutual terms, and here's the reason why. It might be mutual terms if at the beginning of employment they said, hey, to be employed here, you have to sign this. The problem is that Jonathan had been the vice president of Daystar for years, okay? Something changed that made them decide to change the employment relationship, okay? So now it's like, hey, on a whim, we've decided to change. You never decided to change. But if you don't agree to our change, you lose your job, you lose your livelihood, okay? There's a lot more when we talk about mutuality. There is a lot more for Jonathan to lose than for Daystar to lose in that moment, especially since they haven't worried about trade secrets up to this point. let's also look at disparagement, though. Let's go down to that disparagement clause. Now, let's just take a look at it. We'll break it down more in a minute, but let's just see, is this mutual non-disparagement? Does Daystar say, hey, you're not going to say bad things about us? We're not going to say bad things about you, okay? That would be mutual. So let's see if there's any mutuality there. Executive agrees and covenants that the executive will not at any time, here we go, directly or indirectly make, publish, or communicate to any person in any public forum, including social media, any defamatory or disparaging remarks, comments, or statements that adversely affect Daystar or its business or any of its employees, officers, or existing and prospective customers, suppliers, viewers, partners, investors, and other associated third parties. Okay, so basically, what this says is you can't do anything that could be considered disparagement, which basically just means talking bad or saying something negative about or defamation. Now, I will point out to this, defamatory comments, there's no real reason to have them in the NDA because there are already defamation laws. Defamation would mean you're saying bad things that aren't true and they're knowingly not true in most situations, okay? Looking at the rest of this does not in any way restrict or impede the executive from exercising protective rights. So yeah, they could go through and talk to a court. They could talk to human resources about legal concerns, but yes, there is no mutuality. You see right here in non-disparagement, it says nothing about Daystar not disparaging Jonathan, which makes sense because their go-to response in Joni's statement and her interview is to disparage the crap out of Jonathan and Susie to try to discredit them, okay? If this agreement had been mutual and they'd signed it, it would be, you can't say anything bad about us, we won't say anything bad about you, and as long as we're both in the agreement, then we're good. Most church NDAs that we see, it's only one party. Don't say anything bad about the church, don't say anything bad about the ministry, and it never says we're going to protect you. And guys, I have seen hundreds of people who have had their character assassinated by churches and couldn't even respond, couldn't speak back, couldn't say that's not true because it would be disparaging and could embarrass or make the church look bad and hurt the church's business, okay? So first red flag, non-mutual terms. That red flag, from my vantage point, is present. I don't see equal terms, balanced terms, and there's no mutuality in the non-disparagement agreement, okay? So now let's look, number 2, second red flag, is this unreasonable or subjective? And let's look at the definitions of confidentiality, okay? Is this unreasonable or subjective definitions of what confidentiality actually means? So let's go back down to confidential information. And again, it is okay. Boz and John have talked about this. It's okay for them to protect trade secrets, the first thing it says, and proprietary business information. Okay, we don't want you taking out stuff that is proprietary to us doing well as a television network to other people. Now, the only thing I'll say about that is that churches don't have trade secrets and proprietary information. Churches, we're all one body. We all share because we want the body of Christ to grow. We're all part of the same body. We're not competing with each other. So I never see a reason for churches to have trade secrets. So this is something that I would say there's a lot of nonprofits out there that are businesses masquerading as churches under current IRS guidelines. I believe Daystar is one of those. If Daystar wants to be classified as a church, then one, right here in this document, it says they're Daystar Television Network. You can't be a television network and a church, okay? They are, but you shouldn't be able to be because a television network is a business, okay? And a church is a church, all right? So I don't think as long as they're classified as a church that the trade secrets and proprietary information holds water. They need to decide if they're going to be a business or a church, but that's not a huge deal with the NDA itself. It's more of a, should Daystar be classified as a church, which I think that they should not be, okay? But the rest of this definition, any information about the business operations that's private and not generally known or accessible to members of the public, media, press, and this is big, or detractors of Daystar. That lets you know a couple of things, okay? One, they don't want, I believe this is overly broad, okay? This is something we always look for on NDAs. I believe that anything the public wouldn't normally know is overly broad because there's things that the public doesn't know that at times they may need to know or that you're talking about and the public wouldn't generally know because they don't work there, but it's not private, it's not proprietary, it's not trade secrets, it's not what NDAs were designed for. So I don't think any of that I think all of that is too broad, but there's two pieces. There's two pieces that Daystar included in this that I think are very telling. They included the media, which basically says you can't go to the media about things. Well, why do you go to the media about things when things are being done that are inappropriate or that are abnormal? Okay, we don't go to the media and go, hey, this business is running exactly like businesses should. That's not what we do. We say this business is like, they're engaging in what I think is fraud. Could you investigate it? Okay, so they said media specifically, but also they said, look at that, detractors or detractors of Daystar. So basically, if I share something that wouldn't generally be known to the public with a detractor of Daystar, I'm in trouble. That lets me know a little bit more of what their intent looks like to me. Okay, I think it gives us a sneak peek to what intent is. Can I know their intent? No. Do I think this shows it? Yes. Okay. Because when you put media and detractors, it tells me that this NDA was most likely put in place to protect them from Jonathan sharing anything with the media or detractors, which makes me think they knew that he was concerned, which based on his testimony, they should have known that he was concerned about a lot of these things. Okay. What else does it say? Confidential information includes without limitation information that's designated as confidential by Daystar or any officer or trustee, which means all Daystar has to say is that's confidential. And when it says any trustee or officer, it doesn't say it has to be written. It doesn't say it has to be written in advance. Basically, anybody at Daystar or any officer or trustee, which means Joni could have just looked up one day and said, Jonathan, that's confidential. You can't say it. Now it's confidential and it's protected. Okay, so they've already got one broad definition that would say, hey, that might embarrass us. You can't do that. But now they say, I said it was confidential. That makes it confidential. I say it's confidential now. That makes it confidential. Okay, and they say something specifically that includes. Okay, it includes about board members' respective actions or decisions. So that means he couldn't report any questionable actions or decisions that he wasn't sure if they were criminal or not, or if they were abusive or not. He couldn't report those. Daystar's financial condition. So he couldn't talk about anything finances-wise, which, by the way, let's just talk about this. Daystar is a church. Churches should be transparent with their finances. But secular nonprofits have to tell you everything they bring in, how they spend their money. Nonprofits are not supposed to hide their financial information, yet Daystar is asking Jonathan to sign a nonprofit or an NDA to hide all of the information even from donors. And because they're classified as a church and not a secular nonprofit, Daystar doesn't have to and has not filed 990 forms, which are public financial disclosures. So even though that's legal and specific, I actually think it oversteps the bounds of what a church or nonprofit should have. And then, of course, it talks about marketing plans, business plans. Those should be protected. Marketing plans and business plans, I'm totally fine with those being protected. I think that's within that's not super subjective or overly broad. Okay. But overall, is this unreasonable and subjective definitions of confidential? Yeah. Okay. It's anything the public doesn't know. That's unreasonable and subjective. Anything that Daystar says, that's unreasonable and subjective. There's a lot of things you could share that really shouldn't be a problem to be shared, but could open you up to legal liability under this. So second red flag, the first red flag, non-mutual terms is there. The second red flag, unreasonable or subjective definitions of confidential, that seems to be here in this document. Okay. And then C, it actually says, let's look at B and C. B, confidential information shall not include general information and training. Number 2, information that's readily ascertainable to the public. And 3, information that the employee has a duty or legal duty or right to disclose. So it does say, hey, there's certain things you can disclose, but it still is protecting you. If it's illegal, you can disclose it to the courts. And if it's not illegal or outside of the courts, you can't disclose anything else that wouldn't be known to the public. So that still seems overly broad to me. C, the executive agrees to hold in confidence and not to directly or indirectly reveal. And indirectly means like potentially even doing it on accident, report, publish, disclose, or transfer any confidential information to any person, entity, at all. So basically that transfer is also very important there. Jonathan and Susie would not have been able to share these recordings or transfer anything to the Roy's report or other reporters under this. So again, the first two red flags are there. This is a unreasonable and subjective definition of confidentiality from my perspective, and I think most people's perspectives. I think it fits the things that Boz and John warned us about. These aren't non-mutual terms. Let's look at red flag number 3 to see if it's there. Are these longer than necessary terms? Well, that one's an easy one. We've already looked at. There's no end date to these terms. John said, keep it short. Boz said there should always be an end date. So since there's no end date, yes, that's the fourth red flag is 100%, or the third red flag is 100% there. Let's go to the fourth red flag. Conditions that are difficult to manage. There's nothing really specific that makes this difficult to manage outside of it's so broad. It would be easy to break this by accident with their definition of confidentiality. The other thing that I think makes this difficult to manage is the non-compete clause. So let's go back down to the non-compete clause. I've been on record, SAI has been on record. We don't think there's ever a reason for a church to use a non-compete. Again, we are not competing with each other, okay? If a person wants to leave and start a church down the street, these are not competing businesses. We're all part of the same kingdom, okay? We can have as many local gatherings as we need to have. So having a non-compete, I don't even like them in business. And here's a secret. A lot of these non-competes won't hold up in court for a business, okay? There's a lot of people who think these shouldn't be used in business at all. I am one of those. I tell my business clients when I'm doing my work as a business consultant that non-competes are going to hurt you more than they help you. But they got a non-compete where it says after employment with Daystar and during, that Jonathan for 2 years can't directly or indirectly own, operate, manage, consult with, control, participate in, be employed by, maintain, have any interest whatsoever in a competitor enterprise anywhere in the world. And here's the two things that are engaged in the broadcast of Christian programming similar to that provided by Daystar. So the broadcast of Christian programming similar to Daystar means more than just television networks. Did you see how broad that is? It doesn't explain it any farther. Literally, Jonathan could get on YouTube, make a YouTube video, and they could have said, hey, you're engaging in the broadcast of Christian programming. And that's too similar to us because we also use YouTube. We also broadcast digitally, okay? So do you see how a non-compete, it's not just saying you can't go work at another Christian television network. This is going like super broad there as well. And a lot of people don't think about those things. So I think that would be difficult to manage as well. So I'm going to say on 4, I'm going to say it's about 50-50 for me. It's partially difficult to manage. It's not a complete red flag. That's a yellow flag to me, okay? But it runs the risk of being difficult to manage. So even though I'm not going to give them a red flag there, if I were Jonathan, I would have taken it to my attorney and I would have said, hey, if I'm looking at this, we're going to have to make this a green flag, okay? We're going to have to remove the non-compete. We're going to have to make the language very clear and more specific on what's confidential before I'll sign it. So I wouldn't sign an NDA like this, but we're going to call it a yellow flag for now, or half of a red flag. And then the last red flag, penalty clauses, severe penalty clauses. So let's go ahead and let's look at the penalty clause, remedies and tolling here in number 4. Executive acknowledges and agrees that any breach of covenants and agreements in this agreement. Okay, so here's what a breach would do. If you tell anybody anything that isn't known to the public or that Daystar said or any of its executives said, that's confidential, or you say anything that could be considered disparaging. Again, those are way too broad. Anything in this agreement, a breach of this agreement that could cause immediate and irreparable harm to Daystar, that's going to go back. Immediate and irreparable harm is going to go back to, they said it would harm us if they disparaged us. So again, anything that could be considered negative based on this agreement could look like irreparable and immediate damage to Daystar. Therefore, in the event of a breach or threatened by a breach, by the executive of this agreement, Daystar, in addition to other rights and remedies available to it, here it is, shall be entitled to injunctive relief and may apply to any court for specific performance, temporary, preliminary, and permanent injunctive relief. That means injunctive relief means we can take you to court and sue you. Okay, so here's the penalty clause. If you break this in any way and we feel like it's harmed us, we're going to sue you. Okay, we're going to sue you. We're going to try to get money from you because you broke this. Okay. And if you look at number 8 as well, attorney's fees, if either Daystar or executive engages in one or more attorneys to enforce any of the terms of this agreement, all right, or there's a breach, which is what it says next, all right, or any lawsuit claim is actually filed, the non-prevailing party shall be responsible to promptly pay reasonable attorney's fees. So basically here together, those two things together is the penalty clause. If you breach this in any way, even with disparaging remarks that we think harm us, we are going to sue you. And if we win anything on this really broad, hard to follow non-disparagement agreement, non-disclosure agreement, then you have to pay our attorney fees. So go back. John said specifically, hey, you have to pay our attorneys to sue you, would be the example of a bad penalty clause. And essentially that's what this is. It's not far removed from that, okay? So that's the penalty clause. So I'm going to say that's a red flag. So when I look at the red flags, are there non-mutual terms? Are there unreasonable and subjective definitions of confidentiality? Are there longer than necessary terms? Are there conditions that are difficult to manage? Penalty clauses. Out of John's 5 red flags, I see 4.5 that exist. 4.5 of the 5 red flags that would make this a really bad NDA. Well, then let's go back. Boz said a lot of the same things, but what did Boz say? One of his biggest red flags was a non-disparagement clause. Okay, non-disparagement clause. So I'm going to say that's the 6th red flag. And then again, the 7th red flag to me is that the majority of the common terms that are needed in an NDA, including an end date, those aren't there. So there's pieces missing from just what should be there. So for me, out of 7 potential red flags, there are 7. Really, out of 6 red flags, there are 7. This fits all of the markers that Boz and John described as a bad NDA and an NDA that they would recommend that people don't sign. So overall, when I look at this NDA, when we look at it together, I would have recommended that Jonathan didn't sign it, and I'm thankful for his courage that he was willing to lose his job, get a huge pay cut, and eventually lose his livelihood altogether for not signing this, because the information that's out now would not be out under this agreement, or he would have to be scared to death of getting sued. So what can we learn from this NDA that we can apply to other church NDAs if you ever see one? Well, there's a few things that we can learn. Now, before I get into those lessons, though, I want to remind you, if you want to go deeper than this video goes, because we're just scratching the surface of NDAs and how they're used in churches, but you can check out this video, which is the first part of a 3-part series where we go deep into NDAs. You're going to hear a lot more from Boz, a lot more from John and other experts. You're going to hear from a lot of other legal places where we talk about these NDAs. And in those videos, we show you quite a few church NDAs, different ways they can look, okay? But here's some lessons that we can learn from this NDA and what we've learned from John and from Boz today. One, if an NDA is going to be used, especially in a church or ministry environment, okay, it needs to have very specific common terms, okay? We need to know clearly who are the parties, what's confidential, and that needs to be specific in scope, what confidential is. We need to know how the secrets can be used, and the NDA needs to have an end date with clear expectations of what happens after it ends, okay? So if those aren't there, automatically what we've learned is that's probably an NDA that you don't need to sign until you've taken it to an attorney and ask your attorney about these things. Try to negotiate these components clearly and specifically into the NDA, okay? What we've also heard from both secular and Christian attorneys here, though, is that the markers of a bad NDA, especially in a church, that if you see those, you need to run, you don't need to sign it. And churches, we have learned our NDAs should never look like this. Our churches need to, if we are going to use an NDA, they need to be about trade secrets, proprietary information, and they need to have the components of a good NDA, okay? If we are going to use an NDA, they got to have those. Outside of that, though, if you're using an NDA whether you're calling it an NDA or not, again, it could be, you could call it a confidentiality agreement. Your church could call it a severance agreement where you got to sign this to get a severance payment when you're, fired. Your church could put it in as a non-disparagement clause in the employee handbook when you get signed, when you first sign on to employment. All of those things are considered NDAs. But if your church has an NDA, I already think that's a red flag. But if they have the good components and they don't have any of the bad components, the church NDA, even though I don't like it, may be okay. So here's what we've learned to look for in these NDAs, though. We need to make sure the terms are mutual. If there's a non-disparagement agreement, my church needs to also commit that they're not going to say disparaging things about me, okay? So if we both agree, we're just not going to say mean things about each other. We're going to be as nice as possible. That's better. But also, let's talk about what disparagement is and not leave it so broad that it's anything that might be embarrassing. We've literally seen that in some of these contracts before. The other thing, what is confidential? We need very specific and reasonable ideas of what's confidential. It's these trade secrets. It's this. For churches, the most common good reason that's very specific, you're not going to give away any personal information, financial information, or counseling information that you learn from parishioners. Because if you're a pastor, they need to be able to trust you. Let's protect our parishioners. That would be a good confidentiality term, okay? So are those definitions of confidentiality, are they reasonable? Are they specific, or are they subjective and broad? Subjective and broad or unreasonable is going to be a big red flag we always need to look out for. Again, are the terms as short as possible? They shouldn't ever be longer than necessary, so there should be terms, and the terms should be as short as possible. I have never seen a church NDA that actually had terms where it had an end date that was short. I've rarely seen them with end dates, okay? So again, churches just aren't very good at this, and that's something we need to learn. It doesn't need to be there. And then the last thing, the last two things are, is it difficult to manage, or is this a pretty easy? I know if I'm abiding by this NDA, and this is something that I could easily do, for the short term of it. And then what are the penalty clauses? One of the things that John said that I think we've got to pay attention to is sometimes breach is inevitable, and you were going to accidentally breach one of these things. So there needs to be penalty clauses that allow you to do your best to fix this without just getting sued immediately, okay? So those are things that we're looking for specifically. The biggest lesson, though, that I think we can learn is that NDAs just aren't worth it in the church. I don't see the benefit outweighing all the potential negatives of this. Also, because these broad sweeping NDAs are illegal, this type of NDA, I believe, would be ruled illegal in a court of law if this were a secular business, okay? Now, sometimes they'll let these stand with executives in secular courts of law, so that might be an issue here because Jonathan was an executive. But if the secular world knows broad sweeping NDAs to silence people are unfair and shouldn't be done, it seems to me that the church would want to be more above reproach and say, well, if it's bad in the secular world, it's really bad for us. And then I think the last thing that we've learned is we've really got to ask questions about whether or not churches should ever have trade secrets, proprietary information. I don't believe they should. That's going to be up to you whether you believe they should. And then I think the final thing that we've learned, and this is not just for the church as a whole, but this is about the Daystar scandal in this situation that we find ourselves watching unfold publicly before the world. And make no doubts about it, whether myself and other YouTubers reported on it or not, it is out there. Secular news organizations have reported on this at this point. Okay, it does make Christians and the church look bad. Okay, it really, really does. And if we don't respond to it and say that's not okay, it's going to make us look worse, okay? But what can we learn specifically about this? I think we've learned that the version of the story that Joni gave us about NDAs, from my opinion, you decide on yours, it doesn't seem, from my opinion and the facts that I see, how I understand these, the NDA seems to not match up what she said it was. It seems to be much broader and potentially silencing than Joni said it was. One thing we know for sure, this is about more than trade secrets and just business information. Okay, the non-disparagement clause by itself said it's more than that. So, and then I think, I said that was the final one, but I guess it's not. I think the final thing that we really have learned from this is that I think we've learned that if you have the courage not to sign these, and we have the courage to go public about things like these, that if it's uncomfortable enough for churches to use them, eventually they'll stop using NDAs. Okay. And hey, that's how Church Disrupted was started. My wife was fired from a church. Okay. And she was given an NDA to sign. And if she signed the NDA, she'd get a hush money payment. She would get severance. And if she didn't, she wouldn't. We refused to sign and we went public. And that's how Church Disrupted started long before I knew this was going to be a podcast. It's how the Spiritual Abuse Institute started long before I knew we were going to have a nonprofit doing this research and education work. Okay. So I think one thing that we can learn from this is if we'll have the courage to stand up and say, no, we're not going to sign silencing documents like this. And if you don't take them away and you keep asking people to sign them, we're going to go public. I think we've learned that if we do that, it makes it harder for churches to engage in behavior like this and harder for them to get away with spiritual abuse and silencing tactics. So I want to encourage you, if you had to sign an NDA and you needed to sign it for the severance, whatever, don't feel bad about it. Just know that you were unfairly treated. I believe you were unfairly treated. If you haven't signed an NDA and they put one in front of you, would you consider having the courage to not sign it? I know it's scary, but would you consider having the courage to not sign it and to set an example and to say, hey, if we're going to use these, I'm going to make a public disclosure that we're going to use these. I think that helps the church. And if you're a church and you use NDAs, would you stop? Would you talk about whether or not this is worth it? And then this is the final thing. This is the one thing that we can all do. Regardless of whether you've ever seen an NDA, because many of you are going to say, I've never even seen an NDA, Jeff. I've not worked on a church staff. Nobody's asked me to sign an NDA. We can all ask our churches the simple question. And we need an answer that is yes or no, because it is a simple yes or no question. Does our church use NDAs or any document with non-disparagement or confidentiality agreements in them that goes beyond protecting parishioners' personal information? Okay, I think that question right there, anything beyond parishioners' personal and financial information, I don't think it needs to be protected. And asking your church if you use that. If so, ask them why. And I would consider, if I were you, asking them to stop. Okay, if we'll have these conversations with our churches, many of us, we can have conversations that lead to stopping NDAs without ever even having to go public with them. Okay, but again, you can find out a lot more information on the longer NDA version. I hope you've learned something from this today. But where I'll land the plane, from my perspective and from the perspective of the SAI board, I believe I can say with certainty, we don't believe there's ever a use for an NDA that goes any farther than protecting parishioners' private information. So I'd love to know what you think, though. Do you think we're being too hard on this? Do you think we got it wrong somewhere? Do you see this document a different way than we did? Do you know anybody that's had to sign an NDA? Were you asked to sign an NDA and turn it down? I would love to know all of those things. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to start a conversation with you, and we would love to get as many conversations going as possible about NDAs use in the church, because if we have enough conversations about it, I believe that NDAs will eventually either stop being used by churches or they'll be used in a way that is much more protective of people and much more honoring of Christ. So again, we would love to hear from you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. And let us know if there's any questions you have about NDAs that we didn't ask. Maybe we can do another episode on this, or maybe we can do an interview with Boz or another attorney down the road. That could be helpful. So let us know if that would be helpful for you. But that's all for today's episode. Again, until the next episode, grace and peace. But we'll see you on the next episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. We love you guys. We're grateful for your support, and we'll see you soon.